Now we can start. My name is Sergei Plotkin, and I'm the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute. And today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Victoria Sereda. Victoria will be talking on really very, very important for today's Ukraine and generally for Eastern Europe topic on displaced persons in Ukraine, internally displaced people. Normally that topic would fall under responsibility of Emily Sharon Justice, our brand new contemporary Ukraine program. But I am doing this introduction today because Victoria has, among other things, and among many hats that she wears, one of those hats is related to MAPA Digital Atlas of Ukraine project, and Victoria is associated with what we do at the Institute within MAPA for now a number of years, really being the driving force behind a number of modules, including on religion, on history. Actually, all the modules dealing with contemporary Ukraine on the website of MAPA project, they are in one way or another related to Victoria's research. Victoria started as a historian, I'm proud to stress that. But then I don't know what happened in her academic career. Maybe you decided that the two historians in one family it's too much, but you're going to stop, certainly stayed focused on history. And Victoria went to study sociology, and she graduated from MA program at the University of Budapest, and then also the master program Research in Sociology at the University of Edinburgh. Since then, she has been involved in a number of international projects, including the one that she played a very important role in. It's the project in Switzerland, and published extensively in Austrian, French, German, Hungarian, Polish, and Russian academic journals. Again, we are very lucky that Victoria has been working with us for the last maybe three and a half years. And the research that she did, partially it's already present on the website in our interactive map, partially is still making its way there. What we want to do here at this institute, at least for the next year and then probably in the foreseeable future, to pay as much attention as we can within the MAPA project to Eastern Ukraine, to Donbass, and one of the ways to deal with that big issue when you really can't go into the areas that are claimed today by the separatist forces is really to look at what kind of impact the conflict and the people who come from there have on Ukraine. And my understanding is that that is also one of the angles that Victoria Sereda will present today.
Yes, thank you, Sergei. I'm really very pleased and honored to present research with which I'm since 2014. As Sergei noticed, I'm by my first training historian, and due to certain circumstances I had to switch to sociology, but I find my way to merge those two approaches, studying for many years historical identities and memories in Ukraine, and this was my main focus till 2014. This is still part of my research, but since 2014 something happened to our society, to Ukrainian society, which for me as sociologist I could not stand aside with my interest in history in past, and I had to pay much attention to what was happening to the society in the present, and what I'm going to present you today I'm sorry for this.
Looks like
It's the
physical
plug, just the
connection,
plug,
yeah.
yeah.
Yes, but
It is.
Okay.
yeah,
There
good,
it is, go.
good.
I'll,
Don't move.
I'll try my best. Is and hope will be part of my book project on which I'm working recently. So first of all, what happened? We have the first wave of IDPs beginning March 2014. First, it was caused by the annexation of Crimea, and people had to flee. Those who didn't want to stay for different reasons on the peninsula, they started to move towards Ukraine. Unfortunately, this graph begins only 2016, so we cannot see the changes in numbers of IDP population. And then, as a reaction to the Euromaidan from the beginning of March of 2015, we witnessed protests by pro-Russian and anti-government groups which took place both in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine. But real armored conflict started with the Russian military unit raid on Slavyansk. If you remember, this was mid-April. And beginning mid-April, we have a second wave moving from Donbass. And with escalation of conflict, the number of those who were fleeing increased rapidly. And it peaked in 2015 when Ukraine only registered, as you probably see here, registered IDPs on the Ukrainian territories went up to 1.8 million population. And again, here I want to stress that according to at least our research in which I was involved, approximately 1/3 of those who moved or resettled in any direction would not register as an IDP, so probably real numbers would be much higher. And at this point, this was the biggest IDP population in Europe and fifth by number in the world. After the ceasefire agreements and when conflict became more frozen with lesser casualties, we see from the graph some part of population, IDP population, started to return back. Others just decided not to continue their registration, so this decrease in numbers again would have different motivations. And it is also important to understand how this resettlement looks like. So if we look at the territories where they went to, we see that approximately 50% of them stayed on the same territories, on close to the contact line on Donbass, over here. So these two oblasts would encounter for the approximately half of the IDP population, but at the same time, if you look statistically, this light blue means pensioners, which probably would mean that some part of them, some numbers, would be those pensioners who stay on both Ukrainian government controlled and non-controlled territories, and would commute if they stay on non-controlled Ukrainian government territories every 2 or 3 months, so it depends on the situation, to get their pensions or to get their financial support. Another two oblasts nearing would again accommodate, 3 oblasts would accommodate another 15%, and Kyiv and its surroundings also would accommodate approximately 15%. So the rest of Ukraine would accommodate 20% of the number which I told you. Another very important issue just to stress is that we have 2 different things, IDP type of registration and Soviet type propiska or registration. And if we look how state sees or counts the population of each locality, And you have an example of Dobropilla. This is a small city near the contact line in Donetsk Oblast. I just brought it as an example. You will see that actually, according to the state official statistics, the number of population between 2013 and 16 even slightly decreased. But if you add the data with officially registered IDPs, you would have another 14,000, which would be almost half of the population. But city would receive resources according to the official statistics. So for medical care or for social issues, those cities which along the contact line would really encounter a much greater social issues and problems, because state doesn't see this population, which on the top of officially counted is present in those localities. If we are talking about my theoretical approach, we see that more and more immigration studies are talking about belonging, using this category not identity, but by belonging. And they are saying in many Western European countries, in Britain, for example, fueled also by this Brexit discussions, we see the situation when this debate around immigration becomes a core debate about who has rights to belong, and they're constantly reiterating or trying to reassert who is actually part of this core, who are those groups which belong to our society, and who is excluded. And for me, it was very surprising to find that actually the solution for this issue for them is absence of national borders. So they say if there will be no national borders, there will be no anxieties about the belonging and who is entitled for material or some symbolic resources. But if we look and consider Ukrainian case, I think this might shed a very interesting light, because we see that we have a big number of population which is resettled within the national borders, but still fosters a discussion about who is entitled for what is entitled, who is us and who are those who do not belong to our society. So in this sense, Ukrainian case can bring a lot into this debate about the immigration or internal migration and belonging. Why belonging? First of all, it brings us, at least me as sociologist, to Brubaker's argument that one should look not so much to uniform groups and practices, but analyze situations when particular identity becomes silent and others silenced. And here, this is exactly the case. And for me, identity is much more rigid and essentializing category, and not capable to accommodate this multi-dimensional character of processes of social inclusion and exclusion. And we also see that this is due to some theoretical schools and approaches. Quite often, identity is these groups are looked as very unitary across, as very separate units, especially if we are talking about quantitative surveys. You can be either Ukrainian or Russian or someone else, but you have a possibility to tick only one box. And due to this common interpretation of intergroup bias theory, quite often, as soon as we have groups, we have in-group favoritism, we have conflicts between groups, and all this complexity and multi-dimensional level of negotiations of who belongs, how belongs, which markers are important, is somehow lost for me. So in this sense, I believe that belonging gives us much more flexibility. In some cases, of course, identity and belonging might overlap, because in some cases, some group of people who choose to belong to particular group and they will be using identity markers to explain or develop their belonging. But at the same time, we can have situations when people have different identities, but they also feel that they belong to a particular community or space. So in this sense, for me, it's very important to use this much broader concept, which also helps us to look not only into the categories of people, group belonging, but also how culture and places or some elements of culture become important for the persons to build their belonging. Another important dimension as for historian for me would be, of course, temporal experiences and the way how memory and past is utilized when people are creating their sense of belonging. In this case, I will be talking about internally displaced people. And another very common trait with identity and belonging is that belonging has a relational element in it and process, which would be self and external categorization. So the person or group might choose to feel like someone, but this is very important, whether external community or external group also sees them this way. So we can talk about belonging as a choice, and we also can talk about belonging as imposed exclusion, because certain groups are excluded and they are denied the right to belong to the community. And I will try to develop my presentation according to those two lines. First, I will look more into how IDPs develop the narration about the belonging of choice, and then I will also discuss these lines of acceptance and exclusion. For me, those main research questions would be which markers, and here I'm quite open, I want to see their voice, how they construct their belongings, and which markers they use to claim their belonging or renegotiate it. The second question, which will be closer to the end of my presentation, I'll be looking at it, would be again this relational, how society receives them, and is there any social distancing towards them? Do we see any regional patterns towards social distancing? And what are the main factors which are factors of inclusion and exclusion of IDPs? And a very important challenge for me is how to study relationship between belonging and some cultural and national identification, not imposing certain categories. And again, to give example, I would bring example of discussions about the nature of the conflict in Donbass. These are there is an extensive debate, political and academic, about what happened, why happened. I will not get into the depths, but I will bring just one issue which is important for my presentation. We see that this tradition which we can see in some, again, political and social studies on Ukraine, talking about regional divide in Ukraine, divide from macro-regional divisions of Western Ukrainians and pro-Russian Eastern Ukrainians, continues in this and goes into this debate, and quite often the causes of the conflict are presented as a battlefield between Russia and West, or, for example, as polarized identities and memories project, again with the emphasis on identity and how identity differentiates and how this identity and different identity projects actually became a cause of war. And my evidence and data with which I work give me much more complicated picture than this split along Russian-speaking versus Ukrainian-speaking, or pro-Western, pro-Russian identity lines. Speaking of methodology, here we also have a lot of issues and questions and debates. First of all, when we are talking about face-to-face or telephone mass surveys, we would have these identity boxes to fill, and the issues to bring would be how to calculate sample, safety both of respondents and those who are doing interviews, and possible topics. Yes, and here we have already several published things debating this issue, that one should be extremely cautious and careful to what extent data may be representative when it comes politically sensitive topics on non-government controlled territories and areas which are totally controlled by Russia and military formations and proxies with no hint of freedoms. And here Crimea also will be the case, and I will show you how, at least in our research, it showed up. The question would be how to reach respondents, and also if they are reachable on Ukrainian territories. For me, an important issue to bear in mind and to discuss would be response rates. That in many cases it would be the situation when respondents with pro-Ukrainian positions would be much more open to the contact and much more willing to talk to scholars than those who feel that they don't fit with their point of view to the general picture. We also, another difficulty is that if we are talking about belonging, especially elements of belonging which unfold on everyday level, then quite often it is extremely difficult to study them. Why? But once internalized, those elements are very difficult to reflect. If you ever had a chance to do interview, quite often if you ask about everyday practices or everyday notions, for people it would be very difficult to answer your question because they take them for granted and they do not reflect. So here again, the case of Ukrainian IDPs is extremely interesting case, which helps us to unfold many issues and questions connected to identities, belonging issues in Ukraine in general, because we have this situation what Garfinkel will call break of frame, when something happens in people's lives, this moment when something is disrupting your everyday surrounding and everyday situation. Of course, resettlement would be, and war and resettlement or annexation of the territories would be this experience. People and respondents would be much more reflective of what it means to belong, what it means to be someone. Speaking of the data, I will be using here one quantitative survey data at the very end of my presentation, and also beginning 2014, I was involved in 5 different survey in-depth interviews projects connected to internally displaced people. Sorry.
Just plug it back in, unplug it and plug it back in.
Is it? Yeah. So in total, I have at my disposal 224 in-depth interviews, 44 of them with people from Crimean Peninsula, and 180 from in-depth interviews with respondents from Donetsk and Luhansk. There were 2 main categories: those who left and stayed on selected destination, and those which we could unsuccessful cases of resettlement and people who returned back. We also had 24 people interviews with 24 people on non-government controlled territories without looking at because they stayed there simply. Gender-wise, slightly outnumbered by female respondents, but this also resembled the statistics of IDPs on Ukrainian territories. Roughly, more or less, the same wise age. And with soft parameters, we would also include national and ethnic minorities, religious denominations, and social classes. This map presents you where people came from if we are talking about non-controlled territories. And this where they came from if we are talking about Crimea. And where too, more interviews were conducted with people on territories which lie close to the contact line, because as we saw, these are territories where the biggest part of IDPs is located. But we also had the macro-regional spread of east, center, west, and south destinations. And here you can see where our interviews were conducted on Ukrainian territories, in which cities. And also we had several interviews with people who went to Poland, Russia, and Germany. And you also see the destinations. Major thematic blocks were circumstances of relocation, future of the region, previous traveling experiences, descriptions of their family, reaction to of relative neighbors or colleagues, life before the resettlement, and then everyday life at the new place, experience of new urban spaces or rural, social groups which are important for them, social relations and networks, and specifics of cultural adaptation and historical and memory questions. What were the main difficulties during the interview process for us? First of all, the fear. The most difficult for us was to reach Crimean group, especially those who returned to Crimea. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to get even one interview. There, we tried different interviewers, because first we thought that because of the person who was trying to get those interviews, she was of Crimean origin, but she moved herself to the territory of Ukraine. But this was not the case. Then we found the Crimean Tatar interviewer. Then we found a person of Russian origin from Russia, but nothing in reality worked. And a very similar situation was in Turkey. Unfortunately, we had a plan to conduct interviews with Crimean Tatars there, but they failed after this failed coup. And similar situation happened during one of our field works, when there was a failed assassination of leader of so-called LNR, and immediately all people stopped responding to our requests about the interviews. We also had a situation when one of our interviewers, she was twice interrogated by FSB in Crimea, and again at this very moment we had completely stopped our field work and just withdraw from any plans of continuing this. Many of our respondents have elements of post-traumatic syndrome, because some of them were captured and tortured and had this experience. Many others survived shelling. We also have to encounter for some ideological silencing or sensitive issues experiences, and for the situation when respondents had relatives on non-government controlled territories, and this might also influence their willingness to talk. In many cases, we try to employ sociologists who are themselves IDPs, so to somehow to reduce at least some of those sensitive elements. But sociologists also were under, as I said, physical, ethical, and ideological pressure. And it was very important for us to also to be sensitive to many issues and questions, and be competent in local issues. So if we're talking about general themes which were important for all our interviewed IDPs, we see that, of course, life-threatening situations and political persecutions, if we are talking about Crimea, all of them would talk about sense of lost home, and their narrations quite often would develop in a way that they would say before and after, and constantly go back and forth that we had this situation, how it was before and after. The broader social identities were threatened, and they were trying to reassert them and redefine their belonging to Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Germany, whenever they would go. One of the key issues for them would be citizenship rights, which became really central for their self-understanding. And many of them would opt for defined legal spaces. So it's better to stay when all laws work, either better under as it was before 2014, but at least somewhere where laws would work. And if you're talking about belonging of choice, while I'll be talking and explaining how they unfolded this, you may pass also, I prepared for you a handout with quotations, because here I'm also only talking about the analysis, and it might be interesting for you to see real voices or words, how IDPs use them. Of course, these are only exemplary quotations. I could not bore you with long lists and pages, and I would be really happy to share more with you if you will be interested. So first of all, if we are talking about the Crimean Tatars, their narrative was very different from others. They would use constantly this formula, I would call it unity in plurality, with locating strong regional Crimean, and they even had a name, Crimea, or even a specific name, Krimets, my Krimtse. Ethno-religious would be Crimean Tatar and Muslim markers within Ukrainian political and national canon. So, and also what you would see immediately in almost every interview, importance of local and regional symbolic landscapes. So they would talk about Crimea, and they would talk about localities in many specific details, in types of trees were there, or symbolic markers which were there about their houses. And also what is very interesting, their historical narration is based on anti-Soviet self-victimizing discourse connected to the deportation in 1994. So this would be also the core around which they would build this the understanding of belonging and time. But it also made them somehow ready to accept contemporary Ukrainian nationalist narrative. Many of them would talk about, for example, and you have a quotation in your list about Bandera, how important he is. If we are talking about the IDPs from Donbass, first of all, if we would come from that identity war issue, we would see that in many of their stories and points which were important for them would contradict this narrative. First of all, majority of them would view conflict over Donbass as important from above by superpowers, and would almost never refer to it as in ethnic terms. So they would say that these are the superpowers such as Kremlin versus Brussels or Kremlin versus Washington, in some cases Kremlin versus Kiev, who happened to have a battle on their territory, and that's why we have this conflict, and not because something was problematic there. No reference to ethnic and linguistic conflicts in Donbass before 2015. In stories told by Crimean Tatars, there will be many references to ethnic and religious conflicts prior to 2014. Minimization of importance of cultural linguistic differences within other regions of Ukraine. Again, if we would accept this lens of identity war, then of course for them this should be a very important issue, but they were not talking about it. Many would claim to be Russian origin, who were claiming of Russian origin would explicitly articulate wish for Donbass to return under Ukrainian control. And we also have these cases with people who fled from Crimea who would say, some of them were even Russian citizens before that, but they would say that I wanted to stay in Ukraine because Ukraine offers freedom, and I wish Crimea to return under Ukrainian control. Almost all of them claim to be bilingual or trilingual because some of them were not only Russian and Ukrainian, but used some other languages such as Greek, Polish, depending on the family origin. But would admit that normally they use Russian in their everyday communications. Russian speakers feel linguistically much more differentiated in Russian regions, in Russian territories, than in Ukrainian. In Ukrainian, they would say, our co-fellows in big cities speak exactly the same Russian with the same accent, and we cannot be differentiated in Dnipropetrovsk or Zaporizhzhia or Kharkiv. Some of them had Soviet nostalgia, but which was not excluding current Ukrainian patriotism. Some of them would say that Soviet nostalgia is actually opposing current Ukrainian patriotism. So you would have these two contradicting narratives unfolding in different interviews. And for them, pro-Ukrainian orientation doesn't mean to support Maidan or be supportive of Poroshenko government, and this is very clear differentiation. So we are pro-Ukrainian, but we are against Ukrainian government. We are separating ourselves. We are more into the everyday people by people situation than the government. We don't want to deal with Ukrainian government in many cases. Sense of belonging is lost for them not only into imagined national community, which would be sometimes imagined as Ukrainian and Slavic, as Soviet, but also to regional Donetsk community. Many of them would say that now I have no sense and no point returning there because this is absolutely different Donetsk or Donbass. And also to local immediate community of neighbors or family. We also see, contrary to this position of identity war, that they have very weak regional affiliation. Those who resettled to other parts of Donbass region do not feel more attached to the space than those who resettled to other cities of Ukraine. For example, you would not find argumentations that I came to settle in Donbass because I wanted to stay in Donbass, because I feel Donbass person. In majority of cases, there would be some economical, family reasons or some limitations because someone was ill and they could not move further, or someone stayed behind and they wanted to have a close contact to them. A significant group of interview does not like to associate with the group of IDPs, of refugees, so they wanted to be dissociated with this group. They also feel unjustly excluded. So we are citizens, we are the same people, why we should be pointed or categorized as something else. And they also felt alienated from their own local community quite often, or family members who had some different opinions, for example. Many would talk about split in the family, and many also would say that they don't want to meet or somehow gather together or talk to people from Donbass who stayed in the same locality, which for me as sociologist is very problematic and creates a situation of double isolation. Why? Because people moving from one society or community to the other, they break their ties there. So when they come, they are quite fresh to the social relations in the new locality. It takes time to develop those social relations. And if we look at the migration studies, we quite often see that exactly this compatriots group would be this shelter where we can seek for some support, or we can meet and talk. And being afraid that people from the mass might have some different ideological views or specific experiences or something which might not be accepted, many of them refuse to use this opportunity. And here we would have this double isolation. So we neither have a peer group to address to, nor local group is much supportive because these are new social ties. And for Ukraine, this would be very important moment because, as you know, still the country is quite corrupt. And if someone seeks, for example, jobs, many good positions and jobs would be passed by word from the person to person through the social networks and not advertised. Those which go to advertisements or to social support services, usually unwanted jobs, low paid. And this is very important moment for the community. And very striking and very separate trait would be what I would call urban civilization concept. So those who would come from Donbass would focus on their urban, social, and professional identities prevailing over ethno-linguistics. And they would differentiate between people coming from smaller localities to bigger localities, or coming from specific professions. So they would much stronger identify with all Ukrainian urban space than with Russian speaking, or, as I said, their local regional group. And here, this is for me a clear differentiation from peasants. Житель города не огорода, so the person who lives in the city but not on the plot, and from the inhabitants of the smaller towns. This urban space is the most familiar, even including a big Western Ukrainian cities. Doesn't matter that they speak their Ukrainian, but this is important that I'm located with this big urban space. And these cities were described basically not as culturally problematic. Also, some would mention that prevailing Ukrainian language in Lviv, for example, would be problematized, but this is not what matters. At the same time, what would matter, for example, movement from to Kharkiv from a smaller town, or to a bigger cities from a smaller cities. Again, if we are talking about this professional differentiation, we would see they constantly would apply and address this concept of work. So miners and workers are very important categories, but at the same time, they would avoid a direct identification with them. So they are prestigious, important for the region, but we are not them. And they sometimes would even clearly distance themselves from them. So the most valuable would be the middle class from big city identity or markers, how to describe himself or herself. And quite often they would say that the status, the very important element of their pre-2014 experience. Local versus national. The local space is often defined not by a particular locality, but rather to a specific elements such as home, shop, place of work, school, hospital, or in many cases by a local group, like neighbors or family. That comfortable and peaceful local space suddenly, because of these external powers, became dangerous focus, violent of national or international struggle. Lack of articulated interest in specific Donbas history, but rather emerging interest into historical sites at the new places of residence. Kherson, Kyiv, Lviv, Kharkiv, they would go and explore cities, go to museums, attend excursions extensively. And sense of belonging to a national community was redefined not in a uniform way, but we have two groups. One would claim that national identity was and is insignificant to the region. National differences are politically imposed from above, and they are results of this recent manipulations. Others would admit that they went through the definition of the belonging to the Ukrainian nation-state community, and that previously prevailing differentiation was along this ethno-cultural sense of nationality, which was ascribed nationality in a Soviet time. For example, my father by passport was Russian, that's why I'm Russian, but in reality, I feel myself, and then the different story would unfold. So they say that this political sense of citizenship based on self-experience is new and a specific experience for them. And what they would do, they would minimize their own local ethnocultural linguistic differences. So they would say that we are not different from people living next to in the neighboring cities. So we don't feel different. Many of them would claim, both those who came from Crimea and those who came from Donbas, that they were intensively reasserting also their local sense of belonging to a new communities. Of course, important contributing factor would be family or relatives or friends, but and also permanent housing. Many of them would say, I would feel completely Lviv or the seat of whatever city is if I would have my house here or housing. In interviews, we see, especially those which were taken by 2017, that many of them by that time already changed twice or three times their place where they stayed. But what would be very important, this would be matching size of location, moving from big city to a big city, and also active exploration of new space, so going to excursions, lectures, museums, strolling around, and also very important experience, engagement into civic activism. And the map you have there is the map about community support initiatives, which were initiated actually by IDPs themselves, and you see these initiatives go throughout the country, but especially numerous ones are along the border. Temporal location. Very many of them would say that they would use history and they would talk about history in attempts to explain what happened, why it happening to them or to their territories. In attempts to connect to a new place or space, when they go to museums or listen to excursions, and they learn a lot, and in this way they're connecting themselves. And exposure to a new historical narratives. Many would say that the only exposure we had, it was a Soviet school, and now something absolutely new happened to our experience. What would be the main difficulties? First of all, science topics, both in school teaching and in family stories. Conflictual narratives, when we have many localities would have conflictual narratives in symbolic landscapes embedded there, in, for example, conflict between Soviet Ukrainian national, Russian imperial victimhood narratives, and they were reflecting on these issues. Ambivalence of interpretation, when they say we have families or friends on both sides and we have to somehow to maintain our belonging here and there, and also articulated opposition to or indifference to decommunization processes. Acceptance by exclusion. How exclusion work, along which lines? First of all, we are talking about those who were resettled to Ukrainian territories. On average, they would claim that they cannot be differentiated from locals, and this would be a very important element. They would say that they were very rarely discriminated against their language or cultural practices, but major discriminatory experiences would go with apartment renting, so access to material resources, and job seeking. And at the very early stages, also when Ukraine had this 3 or 4 waves of military conscription, another important stigmatization narrative would be that men from Donbass should go and fight for their region, why our sons or husbands have to go there and they stay here. Requirement of registration, which state introduced in attempt to help, actually quite often was used for the exclusion and discriminatory practices. And what they would say in absolute majority of interviews, and actually situation is worsening, at least till 2017, that the major group which would push or exclude them would be not the local communities, but local state authorities, questioning their right to belong to the society and to the locality. IDPs had constantly proved their right to belong to the community and citizenship, as well as associated rights and privileges, for example, privilege to vote on local elections. And many of them would opt for, I like one of my respondents said that, contactless co-living with the state. So we are here, but we don't want any contacts with the state official or government. But instead, they would trust in civil society structures. And we also see prevailing alienation from military personnel, both on separatist militants or regular Ukrainian army, which are viewed rather as a foreign element, not rooted in local environment, and of course dangerous. Those who resettled to Russia had slightly different story. So their belonging was questioned along 2 lines. First, through the citizenship, which is same would happen in Poland, in Germany. Formally, they are Ukrainian citizens, so they have to comply with all restrictions and regulations concerning migration. But also through ethno-linguistic differences. So here, where this ethno-linguistic identity and ethno-linguistic differentiation is much more pronounced. They were quite often spotted because they spoke with a soft Southern Ukrainian dialect, either in Russia or in Poland, so quite easily the people could hear that they are not local. And those who accepted jobs in Russian autonomous republics encountered also issues or tensions between indigenous populations like Khanty, Mansi, Mordvins, and the dominant group. They would say these Russians came and they exploit our resources, and they would, being Russians who came, they would be positioned as people, as others who came and who are doing some wrong things to the local populations. And also what is also important to note that not only receiving communities, but also IDPs themselves were involved into the practices of othering. quite often those who came from Crimea would stigmatize those who came from Donbass. And they would say that this, and you have also quotation for this in your handouts, that these people again should go and vote for their region. They are separatists, and we escaped for quite often for political reasons, because there were no life-threatening situations of war in Crimea. But if we decided to leave, we decided to leave for quite often for political reasons. So I will skip this one, and I will turn to the MAPA moment or element. Every big film has a teaser, so I want to give some teaser or bring your attention to a new model which we will be developing through this year. And I want to show how can we use not only qualitative but quantitative data to look at, for example, issues of belonging, or to look at these regions and how Ukrainian population, what is the relation of Ukrainian population towards them. Here we'll be talking about social distances. You have this big table in your handouts, the very last page. So we asked to measure this. The question would be, would you be willing to accept a person as a member of your family, as a friend, as a neighbor, as a colleague? So this was a 7-point scale where the measure of social distancing toward different groups was measured. And first of all, if you look, I gave you a data to compare pre-Euromaidan and post-Euromaidan situation. And we immediately see that in reality, social distancing to all ethnic or national groups within Ukrainian society decreased after the Euromaidan, with exception to Russians. So here you see that the social distancing would peak by 2016 and then gradually again decrease. And so if you look at the position where the IDPs are positioned, they are positioned quite high next to Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians and Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and also ATO veterans. But we can also look at are there any regional patterns, and this is where MAPA comes. And here you see on your left side, this would be attitude toward IDPs in Donbass, and to the left side, this would be attitudes toward IDPs from Crimea. And in the middle, I place the map where with numbers of IDPs. Why it is important? Because here we see two tendencies. One tendency would be that actually Galicia and Transcarpathia would be much more distanced towards IDPs, both from Crimea and from Donbass. But at the same time, we also see two neighboring oblasts such as Kharkiv and Zaporizhia, which would accept a big numbers of, and we have in Galicia and Transcarpathia we have very small numbers of IDPs. So this is social distancing without seeing, I would say, yes. And in the eastern part of Ukraine, we see Kharkiv and Zaporizhia, where we have a big numbers of IDPs resettled there, and we also see social distancing happening there. So this would be the different phenomena. But the next map shows us another interesting phenomena, that in Galicia, despite this social distancing, these are the same maps. And on the bottom, these are maps which show support in percent of population who supported IDPs during the last year. This would be 2014 and 2017. So what we see that western part of Ukraine, Galicia, for example, and Transcarpathia would declare, and they are traditional actually, in many pre-Euromaidan studies, they were also more xenophobic to different types of groups, who would show this social distancing, but also they would be among those oblasts which were most helping to IDPs in terms of civic activism. And those oblasts which, as I said, in eastern part of Ukraine, which encountered the biggest number of IDPs, would not be helping them. If you look at the Kharkiv Oblast, in both cases, it's an almost blind spot. What are the challenges? So first of all, for me as sociologist, I see that we gradually facing something we can say Donbass and Crimea fatigue. Haran quoted a Ukrainian case study where this fatigue of Donbass situation measured on 10-point scale was already 7 last year. We also have voices saying that, and vote for peace for Zelensky also would prove that there is certain fatigue with the region of the situation in both regions. We also see, and I will show you data about fatigue of too much support. And another issue would be a disagreement, recent discussions boiled in the society about the possible ways of Donbass reintegration. We have this data already in our model beginning 2015. If you will look at the history identity model, there are certain maps which targeting these issues, and we will be adding new maps in the nearest future. So what we can do with MAPA, we can map attitudes of population towards ADPs, toward the regions, towards the possible ways of Donbass and Crimea reintegration. And what we see recently, these issues started to polarize people. And here I am afraid that population IDPs and population of non-government controlled territories might be caught in this debate. Why do we need those separatists? If we have to, for example, if the conditions of reintegration, we don't like those conditions, then why do we need them? And this might, unfortunately, work as elements of social exclusion or new debate about their belonging. So this map is, I just made it today from our survey data, measuring attitudes toward Donbass on a 7-point scale from cold to warm. So the lighter color is, the colder attitude is. Again, you see some regional differences, but also, I don't know how well you can see, but in reality, we face the situation of gradual coldening, gradual alienation. And if you talk about Crimea, we have an opposite situation, that in 2015, our respondents were a bit colder, expressed a bit colder feelings toward Crimea than in 2017. This would be my final slide. Again, this is very recent survey where respondents were asked about different groups which need or require support in Ukrainian society and which receive. So who do you think received the most of the support? And the other question was, who requires support? And here we see that the only two groups which have a highest disagreement in the society between what is needed and what is received, these are military and IDPs. So close to 1/3 of the population claims that they actually receive more than they need to receive. And I looked at what would be the major regions claiming this. Actually, there was neither a single oblast of Ukraine which would say that they receive less than they need. Even in Donbas region, oblast, we would have the situation where populations think that IDPs receive more than they need to receive. And the major oblasts with disagreement would be some in central Ukraine, so Kirovohrad, Khmelnytsky, Vinnytsia, Volyn region, and Donetsk and Zaporizhia. So central Ukraine, and again Donbas itself and neighboring oblasts which receive the highest number of IDP population. So here again I see this worrying for me element that fatigue with supporting them, which might be indicator that finally state stepped in, and we don't need to give them as much support as we did it in previous years, but also might be a sign of some fatigue that we are still supporting them. So conclusions. The level of social distancing toward IDPs is rather low, but might change in the future, as I said. And we do see some cross-regional analysis gives us this distancing and hierarchization toward IDPs, but it doesn't correspond then to traditional macro-regional scheme or ethno-linguistic cleavages scheme with which I began my presentation. Even though the majority of IDPs are Ukrainian citizens who migrated within the national borders, their position and hierarchies of belonging depend both on the region where they were coming from. For example, we have much more positive attitude toward those who came from Crimea, and also on the region what was their point of destination. And finally, I want also comment about my concept of belonging, how I used it here, and what it allowed me to show you and see. For me, it allows us to see how Ukrainian civic nation is functioning when on the one side, certain markers of national identity still remain a so-called minority phase, but at the same time, it demonstrates quite a high resistance to attempts of its fragmentation or attempts to deprive it from the political subjectivity. This strange phenomena when there was a great expectation that Ukraine would break along those big macro regions, and it didn't happen. And it also, for me, helps very much to avoid categorization of IDPs through normative national or political identities, because they often neither use them nor fit to their descriptions. And this data analysis reveals that that in most cases ethnicity and language are not much pronounced in their day-to-day practices. Thank you for your attention, and I would gladly answer all your questions or comments, and I can go in some deeper sides of my presentation following your question.
Thank you very much. I will maybe ask the first question and then open the floor for questions and comments. First of all, thank you really for very, very interesting presentation. And for me, it was, for example, a major discovery, this really gap between the feeling of belonging and the identity, the way how we, this national regional identity, how we define it, that there is no direct linkage between the sense of belonging and language or culture or even region. And from that point of view, again, anywhere in Ukraine, at least your data shows that they felt felt to be equally at home or not at home. Also very interesting for me was the idea that this emotional and otherwise connection to Donbass wasn't a factor. So from that point of view, whether you are in Mariupol or in Kharkiv didn't make much of a difference for them. It is very rich material. The questions that the question that I want to ask is really directly related to what is today in the news, and this is the future of Donbass and the conditions for the reintegration of Donbass. So the first question that I have is, do you have any data of how many of them would actually like to go back home to their now new place? Again, it's not going into Donetsk of 2014, going to Donetsk of 2019. And whether you have any data on, do they think that they want Donbass back in Ukraine, or for that matter Crimea, or they believe that it's better that things would stay the way how they are?
Thank you for those questions, because they are really great, in a sense that, first of all, if we are talking about IDPs from Crimea, they all, Crimean Tatars or non-Crimean Tatars, would claim that when the moment comes and when Crimea is Ukrainian, we will come back. So we are here just waiting for this, for us to be safely return home. With the IDPs from Donbass, unfortunately, with interviews you don't have numbers, because but since we conducted those interviews beginning 2014, at the very beginning, people still had hopes, and they believed that this conflict will resolve soon, so they would soon somehow return. And they also, if you look at the earliest interviews, you will see that, for example, they would use strategy when they will leave someone behind, or, for example, that they will stay longer than under life-threatening situations, because they believed these are just few weeks or few months, and then everything will settle. But the longer they stay on the territory of Ukraine, the less they are willing to return. And right now, majority of them say that no, we don't want to return back, even if Donbass would become a part of reintegrated into Ukrainian society. As I said, because they say that this immediate local community is already lost. So for them, those who stayed there, in majority of cases, or all people they knew, many people they knew, left in different directions. So if they would to come back, this would be absolutely different locality. And if they have jobs and positions and settled on the main territory, they say no. Even no, we already have our new social networks, and we want to stay here. And this is, they say, the same as you, for example, go and study in some other university, in, I don't know, from Lviv to Kyiv, and then you stay there. If you have your job, if you have your social network, then you stay. Of course, we would have a certain number of people who couldn't find jobs, especially this would be men more often than women, who would not fit this job market profile of the regions. And also because of, as I said, at this very early stages, there was a stigmatization toward men. So this would be pushed back. Yes, but if people have a place to stay, if they have jobs, then in majority of cases, they declare that no, they don't want. And with the concern of we asked about the border, and in absolute majority of cases, with in interviews with those who came from Crimea and those who came from Donbass, they said that the border should be as it was. And this might be very interesting for you that we managed to conduct close to 20 interviews or even slightly more on non-government controlled territories. And the only exclusion would be if people were personally involved, would be activists. But if they were not activists, the common people would immediately say that we want Donbass back to Ukraine. Some of them would claim that at the very beginning I thought maybe, but now I reconsider the situation and we don't want to be this in-between zone. And if you ask, they would say, I want the border as it was prior to 2014. So situation back as it was.
Well, thank you very much. The questions, comments? We already got applause, so now it's time for questions. Yes, please.
Okay. In my dotage, I've learned not to believe things I've only been told. But I have been told that the Greeks of the Black Sea have been there for 3,000 years and still speak a form of classical Greek. If you think that is so, can you say what you think has become of these people?
I don't know which language they spoke, but we had several interviews with, as I said, if you remember, there was a subsample of national minorities, and among those were Greeks. We had several interviews with Greeks who claimed that they were speaking to their elderly some sort of Greek language, and this helped them a lot because there were different ways how to resettle, and there were some more difficult ways where individuals or families had to go no one knows where, but there were also these national cultural organizations which were helping their ethnic groups to resettle. And here we had the cases of Poles, of Greeks, and of Jewish origin people who were helped by national, cultural, or religious communities.
Thank you.
Igor, can I ask you about the Luhansk and Donetsk IDPs there? Right? I was just talking to actually the person from UNHCR, and she said that this data that they put together, right, like this, should be taken with a grain of salt, because a lot of people, especially in these two regions, the closest to the conflict zone, are not really there as IDPs. In other words, they come to register, collect their pension, and then they go back, right? So I can't remember now when you were showing the attitudes. Like, was there on the maps also like more? Like, is the local population like equally accepting, or is it like less accepting, more accepting towards people in the attitude towards? So it seems like colder, right? Like, I wonder if that might have something to do with the fact that they know that they're not really IEPs. That they're, I mean, did that come up at all in any interviews? The fact that we don't accept them for this reason, that they're not like real IEPs.
First of all, there will be a lot of social issues concerned with housing, with jobs, and you have to bear in mind that in both in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, many cities were so-called monocities with very simple industries, and if you come from a big city looking for a job there, and you have quite a big number of people who resettle there, so this animosity also could be about the resources. And what also came, the pensioners would say, for example, that we need social support, and they are taking it from us because more resources are given to them. But we also would, if you look at this map for the activism, I had a case in my interviews in Dobropilla that if people would come from, as I said, this urban identity important issue, if people would come and families would come from a bigger city, they are used to, for example, having entertainment or having certain things which are not present in these small mono-industrial cities. So what they would do actually, they will be those creative class, middle class people. If something doesn't exist, they would establish it. And some of them would have a knowledge and capacity how to write a grant, how to apply. So they would also somehow mediate between the local government, some international donors or some volunteer organizations, and local activists, and help them to establish, I don't know, clubs for kids, pizzerias, which they are missing because in Donetsk they have a lot of them, and now I'm missing a place. Many new jobs as well. And I guess one of the most interesting cases would be Mariupol, because right now again this linkage between those who are settled and locals, they are trying to brand it as a touristic city, with many interesting projects to unfold there.
Yes, please. You're still interested in
Yeah,
this question?
I had a question about something you mentioned. I was interested to hear a little more about. You were mentioning about the IDP registration intended to be something that was helpful, but you mentioned that in some way it became a basis for discrimination, or that I was interested to hear more about that, about how that happening and is happening, and what the dynamics of that.
First of all, at the very early stages, people were unwilling to register, especially again, quite often men, because first they were afraid that this conscription they will be targeted, and for them it would be extremely difficult to come back and shoot in their neighbors, for example. But then another rumor which was spreading, again, if we are talking about the historical memory and traumas, many of them were afraid that these lists of those who are registered will be accessible to this LNR, so-called LNR, DNR governments, and if someone had relatives there, they might be also target for pressure. Younger and middle class people who well-to-do would opt it not to register just because they say, I'm a citizen. It doesn't matter whether I came from Donetsk or I came from any other city. If I have resources, if I have jobs, why do I need to get this label and be labeled as IDP? Or quite often they refer to themselves as refugee, беженец. I don't want to be associated with this. And then, as I said, since the numbers of people who registered, and we see it, is extremely high on those close to contact line territories, and with this registration, there is a rule that you have to show up first it was every 2 months, if I'm not wrong, and now it's every half a year, to prolong this status, or to be able to receive your pension. And then this would create crowds of people. If we have 30,000 city and we have 15,000 registered, which means that they would come eventually every few months, and they need to show and actually prove that they are citizens, they have rights, and they are themselves, and they have rights for their pensions or for their state support. And of course, the post-Soviet local bureaucracy was never very friendly, so it's not only with IDPs, but if you have a crowd of people queuing for the whole day or for several days in front of your office, and then they would start to comment on them that we don't need you. Similar situations were also reported from Kyiv ministry officials. Why are you coming here and creating us some problems?
Do you have any data about what motivates people to go to specific places? Is it really about having connections there? Is it about job prospects? Do you have any sense of what that
We don't have data, but from interview we always asked about the motivation, and these were different reasons. Of course, very important reason would be either presence of family member or friends or colleagues who can help with job, and the most important thing, or job prospects. Because if you have a job, you can rent flat, and if you can rent flat, but many people were going just in no direction, because especially those who were coming from Donbass, because these were life-threatening situations. So I have to escape because I have kids or elderly or myself, I'm afraid, and I have to go somewhere. So they would come to some closer destination like Kharkiv, and in bigger cities there would be volunteers who would stay on bus stations or train stations or some places non-stop, and would just try to give certain shelter or redirect those people. And even those who came to live, some of them would say, I didn't know where to go. I hear, and the Lviv Oblast administration was the first to claim that we are friendly and we are open for people who are seeking shelters. So I heard this and I decided to come. The most pushing out would be smaller localities like villages or small central Ukrainian towns. So there would be many cases when they would come, for example, to relatives, but then they would have to move because the pressure outside of the family would be too high for them to stay there.
So the region that was the coolest is Poltava, it seems to me, yeah? So either it's Crimea or Donbass, doesn't matter, they just, they stay cool. Yes.
Me?
Yes,
All right.
please.
Okay, and thank you, Victoria. Very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask two questions. So one about the perceived need versus the services provided. So the perception is that the services exceed the need, and can you comment on what the real need and the services are? What's the difference there? And then the second, you were talking about the IDPs who want and don't want to come back, and you were saying Crimeans want to go back and the Donbass people don't, and I'm just wondering whether it's the reason is the perceived kind of sense of safety, because in Crimea there wasn't war, and there's you know, the persecution in Crimea has been more covert, whereas it was just so graphic in the Donbass. And then also the economic opportunities, right? So the main source of income is all destroyed in the Donbass, you know, the factories. Whereas in Crimea, possibly the tourism will come back once it's Ukraine. So can you talk about that, or is it really the integrate, because people have kind of found their sense of belonging who came from Donbass versus the ones from Crimea?
First of all, as I commented at the very beginning when we are talking about belonging, for people who came from Crimea, this regional identity and local identity were already very important. And they play roles. So they claim that we feel Crimean, well, would it be it Crimean Tatars or just people of Ukrainian or Russian or other origin who came from there. So this regional identity, and there are several studies claiming that actually if we are talking about regionalism, that strong regional identity was not in Donbass developed, but in Crimea. So this Crimean affiliation is very important for them. And they, from the very early period, they would say that I want to come back because this is my land, I want to be there, I feel strong affiliation to the space, not only people. And in interviews with people from Donetsk, as I said, we don't have this strong affiliation with a locality, and locality quite often is seen through the social network. And if social network is destroyed, then there is no point of coming back, because these are absolutely different people. This is absolutely, maybe economic reasons also, but they would never at least pronounce them. They would say mostly that this social tissue is ruined, and I don't want to return there to this situation.
And the need of the IDPs versus services.
And it is very difficult to assess these needs. Again, as we saw, we have different proportions of IDP population in different oblasts. That, for example, maybe in certain oblasts they more or less met, but again, in many interviews, they constantly reiterate the issue that what they need is housing. And unfortunately, state doesn't have any good programs to provide them with housing.
So the need isn't met in that sense.
In the sense of housing, no. And of course, it will lift the burden, because right now they need two people to work, to have jobs, and one salary will cover housing, and the only second salary will be used for everything else. And if they would have a housing, then of course this would be more like a normal household with both salaries used for many different things. And I saw statistics that somewhere recently that still we have a situation when the income of IDPs, this was a survey, is 50% less than average income of the population of Ukraine. And as I said, this is probably because of this housing need.
Yes, thank you. This was also very interesting for me because we were involved in a project where we gave fellowships to internally. This was through the Shevchenko Society. So we received 75 applications, and the most fascinating thing there were the personal statements, because you really got to hear everybody's stories. And I just wanted to comment on one. First of all, it's very striking that one of your main points, that really the integration between East and West, where the fact that the big cities would be the marker rather than identity or language, it goes to show you that in fact Ukraine was very integrated already before much of this happened. But I'm just going to quote one interesting letter where there was, of course, students are a very specific class, but when someone described from their group of 40 first-year students that 10 went to Ukraine, 10 stayed, and 20 went to Russia, that really was the breakdown. So it sort of goes to show you that really the IDPs there's already a selection, and the attitudes there might not necessarily be reflective of the whole region. So this isn't really a question, this is more of a comment. But that was kind of, the fact that these people, they self-selected to flee rather than stay.
Yeah,
I'm not saying you didn't say that, I'm just confirming it with this.
Bias, and what we try to do, we try to also target those who stayed or those who went to Russia, but as I said, the possibility to access these people and conduct interviews with them is much lower than.
And so just a few more observations. It was true that most of the biggest problem that these students mentioned were housing. A lot of them were living outside of town, sleeping on floors. So that seemed to be the greatest problem. And then, of course, with the Crimeans, most of them were Tatars, and they had the national identity. So for them, Crimea was home much more than for the others who were sort of Ukrainian, pan-Ukrainian. It didn't matter so much. And finally, an awful lot of them had relatives in Poltava, and they were all squatting there in those small towns. So I can see why Poltava would be cool, because Poltava really Poltava Oblast doesn't have big cities. And all of these people, like from Hordivka, Makeyevka, and so on, and they'd have some grandmother in Poltava. So the whole clan would descend and then try to work their way from there. So this is just all, incidental things, but I just thought use this opportunity to share it. Thanks.
Maybe I'll use this opportunity to jump this additional question. And I understand that probably we don't have really figures. With so many people actually traveling from the non-controlled territories to collect their pensions, are there any guesstimates of how many IDPs really we have in Ukraine? And my understanding is, given that you had in-depth interviews, all of them are for real. None of them really travels to collect pensions. But the question is whether we have any rough number of how many people are there. And second question is there any way to understand, out of the people who came from Donbass, how many people are there because it was the issue, they come from the war zone, it's the issue of security, versus the issue of economic hardship, that's why we are living, versus the issue of the political persecution. We were pro-Ukraine, the separatists took control, we are afraid we are leaving. So again, this all probably difficult questions to answer, but if you have any answers.
With estimates, it's very difficult to estimate, but as I said, those who settled along this contact line would be 50%. So then we might say that estimate would be that those, out of those, the rest 50, at least biggest portion are there. There are also some cases where people would register not in Avdiivka but in Kharkiv, for example.
So the number will be roughly.
But the further we move west, the
more real it is.
The more real it is, and with this front, the contact line, we know that roughly estimate is that 1 million crossings per month. Again, this accounting, we don't know whether one person crossed 10 times a day or these were all single crossings. So here we have a lot of, and of course if you look at the Dobropilya case, it would be total collapse if half of the city population would be living there. In terms of kindergarten, schools, housing, jobs, medical support.
So can you give a number?
I don't know. I would say in between 25-30% who are there, and then.
But the number of people.
but for example, we had these cases in Kharkiv when was within one flat there were 9,000 people registered. So after that we had this harshening policy from the side of Ukrainian government when they discovered several cases with 1,000 registered with the one particular.
Some flats are bigger than others.
So of course there is I would say that at least half of the 1.4 million as it's stated according to the recent report, so at least half.
Okay. Okay. So between 700 and million, that would be the real number of IDPs. And again, there is of course question of under registration for all the reasons that you talked about. Right? And the second question in terms of the breaking down the proportion of people who left for political reasons versus safety reasons versus economic.
At least with those with whom we conducted, majority left for the safety reasons. There was a smaller portion of those who left because of their pro-Ukrainian view. I would say close to 25%. And then, of course, but safety reasons reason and economical opportunities would be somehow also coupled, because if I go somewhere, I at least have some prospects in mind. That I go to a bigger city, I save my life, but also can get some job or can get some support, economic support there. The problem would be again this job discrimination that IDPs experience. That in majority of cases they might be offered lower wages, claiming that you don't have a choice, you need to get something, so you would agree to work lower salary, and they would be denied of certain jobs because, especially better positions, because the argument would be, okay, I will take you, I will train you, I will invest in you, and then when, and there was a certain moment when the feeling was that Donbass will be returned pretty soon back. So, and then you will get back to, and I will lose you as a potential important worker. So these were two reasons why majority. And the third reason would be again that this would be extremely difficult to match the job profile market, the job profile of people fleeing from Donbass with job markets in central Ukraine or western Ukraine, for example. And here we will also have this gender stereotype. For men, it would be much more difficult to accept jobs which would be lower positions or from very different economic sphere. So they would rather stay longer as unemployed, seeking for something similar like engineering job or something. And quite often these engineering jobs would be state jobs which were low paid again. And women would be much more open to different kinds of retrainings and taking any job which is available if we have family here to support.
Well, it looks like the time has come to thank Victoria once again now for answering our questions, and again, it's really illuminating.